She gave a stranger her last $5 at a train station. By the next morning, she was fighting for her life in a hospital, and the man she helped turned out to be a millionaire who refused to walk away. The train station breathed with a restless, uneasy life. Cold air mixed with the smell of metal, old coffee, and wet concrete, and every sound seemed sharper than it should have been, heels striking the floor, wheels of suitcases rattling, distant announcements echoing through the hall. People hurried past one another, wrapped in coats and thoughts, eyes fixed forward as if looking too closely might slow them down or pull them into someone else's trouble. Near one of the outer walls, where the light was dimmer and drafts slipped in through invisible cracks, a small girl stood quietly. She was 6 years old, though the way she held herself made her seem older, as if life had already pressed too much weight onto her thin shoulders. Her name was Emma Wilson. She wore a white dress that had once been bright but now carried the marks of many washings and sleepless nights. Her blonde hair was tied back unevenly, and her blue eyes watched the crowd with a careful, almost wary attention. In her hand, she held a single $5 bill. It was folded and unfolded so many times that it felt soft, almost fragile, like it might tear if she wasn't careful. To Emma, it was more than money. It was warmth, food, and the quiet promise that tomorrow might be a little easier than today. A man stopped not far from her. He didn't belong to the station in the same way others did. His dark gray suit was neat, expensive, and out of place among the worn coats and hurried movements. He had dark hair, carefully combed, and blue eyes that looked distant, heavy with something unseen. His name was Daniel Carter, though at that moment he felt like a stranger even to himself. Emma watched him for a few seconds, studying his face the way children sometimes do, with a strange honesty adults forget. There was nothing loud about his sadness, but it was there, sitting behind his eyes like a closed door. Before she could change her mind, she took a small step forward and lifted her hand. "I only have $5, take them," she said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the noise around them. Daniel looked down, surprised, as if the words had reached him from very far away. His gaze moved from her face to the crumpled bill in her hand. For a moment, he said nothing, and Emma felt her chest tighten, wondering if she had done something wrong. "Is that all you have?" he asked at last, his voice low and careful. Emma nodded. "That's all I have," she replied simply, without self-pity or pride. He didn't take the money. Instead, he slowly lowered himself until he was sitting on the cold concrete floor beside her, ignoring the strange looks from people passing by. At her height now, he could see the small details he hadn't noticed before, the faint bruise on her arm, the shoes that were slightly too big, the way her fingers trembled from the cold. For reasons he couldn't explain, Daniel felt something shift inside him, something he had kept locked away for years. And as the station continued to rush and roar around them, the world seemed, just for a moment, to slow down. Emma did not remember the exact moment when she became alone, only the quiet that followed. It was a different kind of silence, one that settled deep inside her and stayed there even when the world around her was loud. A year had passed since the accident that took her parents, yet time had not softened the memory. She still remembered her mother's voice telling her to button her coat and her father's hand resting on the steering wheel, calm and steady. After that night, everything else felt temporary, as if nothing truly belonged to her anymore. The orphanage had been the first place they sent her. The building was large and gray, with long corridors that echoed with footsteps and doors that closed too loudly. The adults there were always tired, their smiles thin and practiced, and the older children had learned to survive by being harder than they should have been. Emma tried to be quiet, to take up as little space as possible, but fear has a way of finding even the smallest people. She cried at night into her pillow, careful not to make a sound, and during the day she watched the windows, imagining the world beyond them. One evening, after a particularly cruel moment she could not bring herself to remember clearly, Emma ran. She did not plan it. She only knew she could not stay. She followed the streetlights until her legs hurt and her breath burned, and eventually she reached the train station, drawn by the movement and the noise, by the feeling that no one would notice one small girl among so many strangers. Life near the station was made of fragments. Some nights she slept in the waiting hall, curled up on a bench when security was kind enough to look the other way. Other nights she hid under a stairwell, wrapping her thin arms around herself to keep warm. She learned which trash cans were safer to search and which vendors might give her leftover food if she waited until closing time. Every small routine felt like a rule that kept her alive. The white dress mattered to her more than anyone could have understood. It was the last thing her mother had bought for her, and even though it was too thin for the cold and stained in places that would never fully wash out, Emma treated it like something precious. When she found a restroom late at night, she would carefully rinse it in the sink, smoothing the fabric the way her mother had shown her, pretending for a moment that nothing had changed. As Daniel sat beside her at the station, Emma did not tell him all of this. She did not know how to put it into words, and part of her believed that if she spoke too much, he might stand up and walk away like everyone else. Instead, she kept her eyes on the floor, listening to the distant rumble of trains. "Why did you give your money to a stranger?" he asked after a while, his tone gentle but confused. Emma lifted her head and looked at him, really looked this time. She saw the tiredness in his face, the kind that sleep does not fix. "Because you looked like you needed it more than I did," she said. To her, it was the truth, simple and complete. Daniel turned his gaze away, swallowing hard as something old and painful stirred inside him. He had spent years believing that people gave only when they expected something in return, and yet here was a child with nothing, offering what little she had without hesitation. Around them, the station continued its endless motion, but between them settled a fragile, unspoken understanding that neither of them was ready to name. That night, the cold felt sharper than usual, slipping through Emma's thin dress and settling deep in her bones. The station, which had been noisy and alive during the day, slowly emptied, leaving behind a hollow echo that made every sound feel distant and unreal. Emma sat curled up on a bench near the wall, her legs drawn close to her chest, trying to sleep while keeping one eye half open, the way she always did when darkness came. At first, the pain was small enough to ignore, a strange tightness in her chest that made her breathing feel heavier than normal. She pressed her hand against herself, thinking it would pass the way other aches sometimes did. Instead, the pressure grew, spreading slowly, turning each breath into something she had to work for. Her vision blurred at the edges, and the lights above her seemed too bright, almost painful. She tried to stand, telling herself she only needed to move, to find a warmer place or sit differently, but her legs betrayed her. The world tilted, sound stretching and bending as if she were underwater. Emma reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing the edge of the bench before slipping away. Fear rose in her throat, sharp and sudden, but she was too weak to cry out. As she collapsed onto the cold floor, memories flickered through her mind in broken pieces. Her mother's laugh, soft and warm. Her father lifting her up so she could see over a crowd. The smell of clean laundry at home. She wondered, dimly, if this was what it felt like to disappear, if tomorrow would come without her in it. Someone shouted nearby. Footsteps rushed toward her, voices overlapping in panic and confusion. She felt hands lifting her, the rough texture of fabric against her cheek, but everything seemed far away, as though it were happening to someone else. The last thing she noticed was the sound of a siren in the distance, rising and falling like a heartbeat. Emma woke to a world that was too white and too quiet. The air smelled clean and sharp, and there was a steady beeping sound that made her head ache. When she tried to move, her body felt heavy, unresponsive, as if it no longer fully belonged to her. She turned her head slightly and saw tubes, wires, and machines she did not recognize. Doctors spoke nearby, their voices low but serious. Emma did not understand all the words, but some of them cut through the fog in her mind with frightening clarity. Congenital heart defect. Critical condition. Surgery as soon as possible. No parents listed. No guardian. She stared at the ceiling, listening, her small hands clenched beneath the thin hospital blanket. A strange calm settled over her, not because she was brave, but because she was too tired to be afraid anymore. If this was the end, she thought, at least it would be quiet. At least it would not hurt the way being alone had hurt for so long. As the doctors moved away and the room fell silent again, Emma closed her eyes, unaware that somewhere beyond the hospital walls, the man she had met only hours before was already on his way back to her, drawn by a feeling he could not ignore. Morning arrived quietly in the hospital, filtered through pale curtains and reflected off polished floors that seemed to stretch endlessly. The city outside had already awakened, but inside the building time moved differently, slowed by careful footsteps and whispered conversations. Nurses checked charts, adjusted monitors, and spoke in low voices, mindful of the fragile lives resting behind each door. Daniel Carter walked through the entrance just after sunrise. He looked the same as he had the night before, yet something in him had shifted. His suit was still immaculate, but his eyes were shadowed, as though he had not slept at all. He had spent the night searching, calling hospitals, replaying the image of the small girl with the white dress and the $5 bill until the unease in his chest became impossible to ignore. When he finally found her name in the system, relief and fear collided inside him at once. At the nurse's station, he introduced himself with a calm that surprised even him. He asked where Emma Wilson was, his voice steady, controlled, the way it had been during boardroom negotiations and high-stakes deals. The staff hesitated at first, cautious and curious, but something in his tone made them listen. Moments later, he was standing outside her room, staring through the glass at the small, motionless figure lying in the bed. She looked even smaller there, surrounded by machines and white sheets that seemed far too large for her. Daniel stepped inside slowly, as if afraid the slightest noise might break something. He took in every detail, the faint rise and fall of her chest, the thin band around her wrist with her name printed on it, the way her fingers were curled as though she were still holding on to something invisible. When the doctors arrived, Daniel turned to face them. They explained her condition carefully, outlining the risks, the urgency, the cost. They spoke the way professionals do when they are used to delivering difficult news, already bracing themselves for resistance or questions they could not easily answer. Daniel listened without interrupting, his face unreadable. When they finished, he reached into his jacket and removed a folder. Inside were documents, signatures, numbers that made the room grow suddenly quiet. "I will take responsibility for all medical expenses," he said evenly. "Every test, every procedure, whatever she needs." The doctors exchanged glances, surprised by both the speed of his decision and the authority with which it was made. Someone asked how he was related to the child. Daniel paused only briefly. "I'm not," he replied. "Not yet." While arrangements were made and calls were placed, news traveled quickly beyond the hospital walls. Assistants waited in offices, investors refreshed their screens, and partners wondered why Daniel Carter had vanished without explanation. Meetings were cancelled, deals delayed, and rumors began to spread, each one more dramatic than the last. No one imagined that one of the city's most powerful men was sitting beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of a sleeping child. Daniel pulled a chair closer and sat down, careful not to disturb the wires or the soft rhythm of the monitor. Emma's hand felt warm in his, fragile yet real. He stayed there as hours passed, ignoring the vibration of his phone, ignoring the world that demanded his attention. For the first time in years, the numbers and titles meant nothing to him. As the morning light grew brighter, Daniel leaned back slightly, still holding her hand, and made a silent promise he did not yet know how to explain. Whatever happened next, he would not walk away. Not this time. Emma woke slowly, as if she were drifting upward from deep water. Sounds reached her first, soft and unfamiliar, followed by the faint rhythm of a machine somewhere nearby. When she opened her eyes, the ceiling above her seemed too high and too bright, and for a moment she could not remember where she was or why her body felt so heavy. Then the ache in her chest returned, dull and constant, and the memory of the station rushed back in broken pieces. She turned her head slightly and saw a man sitting beside her bed. It took her a few seconds to recognize him without the noise and shadows of the station around them. His dark hair was a little less neat now, his expression tired, but his blue eyes were the same. He noticed her movement immediately and leaned forward, relief passing across his face before he could hide it. "You're awake," he said quietly, as if speaking too loudly might hurt her. "The doctor said you would be." Emma swallowed, her throat dry. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. Daniel did not answer right away. He looked down at their joined hands, at how small her fingers seemed wrapped around his. For a long moment, he searched for words, something honest that would not frighten her. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, but there was an emotion beneath it that Emma sensed even if she could not name it. "When I was a child, I didn't have anyone either," he began. "I moved from place to place, never staying long enough to feel safe. One night, I was hungry and scared, and I thought no one in the world could see me." He paused, taking a breath. A stranger stopped. He didn't know my name, didn't know my story, but he gave me the last money he had. It wasn't much, but it kept me alive. It changed everything. Emma listened carefully, her eyes never leaving his face. "Did you find him again?" she asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. "No. I never did. I spent years wondering what I would say if I ever could. I told myself that if I became someone strong enough, successful enough, I would repay that kindness somehow." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his expression softened completely. "When you held out that $5 to me, I understood. You didn't know it, but you did the same thing for me. You reminded me of who I was before I forgot." Emma was quiet for a long time, absorbing his words. The machines hummed steadily around them, filling the silence without breaking it. "I didn't want you to be sad," she said at last. "I thought maybe it would help." Daniel felt his chest tighten. "It helped more than you can imagine," he replied. A nurse entered the room, checking Emma's vitals and adjusting the blankets. She smiled gently at the child, then nodded at Daniel before leaving them alone again. The moment felt fragile, as though it might shatter if either of them moved too quickly. "Am I going to be okay?" Emma asked, her voice small but brave. Daniel squeezed her hand, careful and reassuring. "The doctors are going to do everything they can," he said. "And I'll be right here, no matter what." For the first time since she could remember, Emma felt a sense of safety settle over her, tentative but real. She closed her eyes again, not because she was tired, but because she trusted that when she opened them, he would still be there. The hours before the surgery passed with painful slowness, each minute stretching longer than the one before it. Emma lay quietly in her bed as nurses came and went, explaining things in soft, careful voices meant to comfort more than to inform. They adjusted monitors, checked her temperature, and offered her small sips of water, all while trying to hide the urgency that hung in the air. Daniel stayed close, never straying far from her side. When the doctors explained the procedure to him in detail, outlining the risks and possibilities with practiced precision, he listened intently and asked questions that surprised them with their focus. Every word mattered to him now. This was not a contract or an investment he could walk away from. This was a child who trusted him to stay. When it was time to take Emma to the operating room, she grew visibly tense. Her fingers tightened around Daniel's hand, and her breathing quickened as the bed began to move. The hallway lights passed overhead one by one, too bright and too fast. "Will you be here when I wake up?" she asked, fear finally breaking through her calm. Daniel leaned down so his face was close to hers, close enough that she could see his eyes clearly. "I promise," he said. "I won't go anywhere." She nodded, holding on to that promise as the doors to the operating room closed between them. Daniel stood there for a moment longer than necessary, staring at the blank surface of the doors as if sheer will might open them again. The surgery began, and time lost all meaning. Daniel sat in the waiting area, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his thoughts circling endlessly. He replayed every detail of their meeting, every word she had spoken, wondering how a child who had suffered so much could still offer kindness so freely. His phone buzzed repeatedly, messages piling up from assistants, partners, and board members, but he ignored them all. Hours passed. Nurses walked by, families whispered to one another, and somewhere a television played quietly, its cheerful sounds painfully out of place. Daniel barely noticed any of it. His focus remained fixed on the doors down the hall, the only place in the world that mattered to him. At last, after 7 long hours, a doctor approached him. Daniel stood immediately, his heart pounding so loudly he was certain it could be heard. The doctor's face was tired but calm, and that alone felt like a small mercy. "She made it through the surgery," the doctor said. "There were complications, but she's stable now. The next 24 hours are critical." Daniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His legs felt weak, and he had to sit down again, pressing a hand to his face as emotion finally broke through his control. Tears came quietly, without sound, the kind that carry years of restraint and unspoken fear. When he was finally allowed to see her, Emma lay pale and still, surrounded by even more machines than before. Daniel took her hand once again, feeling the warmth there, the proof that she was still with him. He stayed by her side long into the night, keeping his promise, watching over her as she slept, and silently hoping that this was the beginning of a life where she would never have to face the world alone again. Recovery did not come quickly, and it did not come easily. The days after the surgery blended together in a slow rhythm of measured progress and sudden setbacks. Emma slept often, her small body exhausted from the fight it had endured, and when she was awake she moved carefully, as if afraid that too much effort might undo what the doctors had repaired. The pain was real, but it was no longer frightening in the same way, because it was surrounded by care and attention she had never known before. Daniel adjusted his life around the hospital without hesitation. Meetings were postponed indefinitely, decisions were delegated, and a world that once demanded his constant presence learned to function without him. Each morning he arrived before Emma woke, and each night he stayed until the nurses gently reminded him that visiting hours were over. He learned the sound of the machines, the routines of the staff, and the subtle changes in Emma's expression that told him whether it was a good day or a difficult one. As her strength slowly returned, Emma began to talk more. She told him small things at first, stories about trains she liked to watch, about a stray cat that sometimes slept near the station, about how she used to count ceiling lights to help herself fall asleep. Daniel listened to every word as if it were something precious, never interrupting, never rushing her. In return, he brought her books with colorful pictures, soft sweaters to replace her worn dress, and apples cut into careful slices, remembering how she had once said they were her favorite. One afternoon, when the sunlight streamed warmly through the window and the room felt almost peaceful, Emma looked at him for a long time before speaking. Her fingers twisted the edge of the blanket nervously, a habit she had when she was unsure. "What happens when I leave here?" she asked quietly. Daniel understood the weight of the question immediately. He pulled his chair closer to her bed, choosing his words with care. "You won't go back to the station," he said. "And you won't go back to the orphanage." She frowned slightly, confusion and hope mixing in her eyes. "Then where will I go?" Daniel took a slow breath. "If you want to," he said gently, "you can come home with me." The room felt very still as Emma processed his words. "Would I stay?" she asked. "Really stay?" "Yes," he answered without hesitation. "As long as you want. As long as you need." Tears filled her eyes, though she didn't cry. Instead, she nodded, once, firmly, as if making a decision she had been waiting to make for a very long time. Daniel felt something inside him settle, a sense of rightness he had never experienced before. The legal process took time, filled with paperwork, interviews, and careful evaluations, but Daniel faced it all with the same determination he had shown in the hospital. When the day finally came and the documents were signed, it felt almost unreal. Emma Wilson became Emma Carter, and with that change of name came something far more important than formality. When Emma left the hospital, she walked slowly, holding Daniel's hand, the world outside brighter and larger than she remembered. For the first time, she was not afraid of what waited beyond the doors, because she was no longer walking into it alone. 10 years passed more quietly than anyone could have expected, not because life was simple, but because it was finally steady. Emma grew in a home filled with light, warmth, and the kind of safety that allows a child to breathe freely. The scars on her chest faded with time, becoming less a reminder of pain and more a symbol of survival. Her heart remained something she had to care for, but it no longer defined her limits. Daniel watched her grow with a mixture of pride and quiet awe. He learned how to be a father slowly, imperfectly, but with unwavering commitment. He attended school events, sat through long rehearsals, and stayed up late helping with homework, discovering that these ordinary moments mattered more than any achievement he had once chased. In return, Emma filled his life with honesty and laughter, grounding him in ways no success ever had. As she grew older, Emma became drawn to helping others, especially children who lived on the edges of the world, unseen and unheard. She volunteered, spoke at small events, and listened to stories that reminded her of her own beginnings. She never forgot where she came from, and she never tried to distance herself from it. Instead, she carried it with quiet strength. The evening of the charity gala arrived almost unexpectedly. The hall was elegant, filled with soft music and conversations that hummed with anticipation. When Emma stepped onto the stage, dressed in white once again, the room slowly fell silent. She did not look nervous. She looked calm, grounded, and certain of why she was there. "My name is Emma Carter," she said, her voice clear and steady. "And many years ago, I was a little girl standing in a train station with $5 and no one in the world." A ripple of emotion moved through the audience as she continued. She spoke about kindness that costs almost nothing, about moments that seem small but change everything, and about how being seen can save a life. She did not mention pain for the sake of drama, nor did she hide it. She spoke with honesty, allowing the truth to stand on its own. When she finished, the room was silent for a heartbeat, and then the audience rose to its feet. The applause was overwhelming, not loud in celebration, but deep with respect. Emma's eyes searched the crowd until they found Daniel in the front row. He was standing too, his expression open, his eyes shining with tears he no longer tried to hide. In that moment, Daniel understood something he had never fully grasped before. All the wealth he had accumulated, all the power he had once valued, had only meaning because of what it allowed him to protect. And Emma, looking back at him with a small, knowing smile, understood something too. A single act of kindness, given without expectation, had not only saved a life. It had created two.